Hello and welcome back to another video in APUS history. Today we're going to be tackling the Compromise of 1850, which is topic 5.4 in the curriculum. So you always want to remain focused on the learning objective, which is to explain the similarities and differences in how regional attitudes affected federal policy in the period after the Mexican-American War. So we're really going to be looking at two key concepts here today. We're going to talk about how the Mexican Cession increased controversies in the United States over the expansion of the institution of slavery. And then we're also going to be talking about how the courts and national leaders made a variety of attempts to resolve the issue of slavery. And the one specific one we're going to be really addressing is the Compromise of 1850. So you can follow along in some downloadable guided notes below. So if you click into the description, you can find some downloadable notes and that will just follow this outline here for you. So first of all, let's do a little bit of context. Let's remember what the federal government's involvement in the institution of slavery has been up till this point in history. So really the first thing that you might remember is the Northwest Ordinance. So in 1787, when the U.S. was negotiating over these new lands in the Northwest area, they determined that when these places became states, they would not be allowed to have slavery. And then in the Constitution as well, there were two aspects. There was the Three-Fifths Compromise, which determined how much enslaved persons would count towards the representation of states that had enslavement, and the Slave Trade Clause, which stated that there would be no ban on slavery for 20 years. And the Fugitive Slave Clause, which described how enslaved persons who had fled to states without slavery would have to be returned back to their owners. So that's kind of in the very early years of the country. And then in 1808, there is an act prohibiting the importation of slaves. So in 1808, it is determined that no more persons from Africa will be brought to the United States for enslavement. Now, this was not really enforced, but the law did exist in 1808. And then more recently in the curriculum, you will have learned about the Missouri Compromise, which I believe I have a map here. Yes, so the Missouri Compromise is this red line here. It's going to admit Missouri in as a slave state and Maine in as a free state. And the federal government is going to determine that any lands north of this Missouri Compromise line will be closed to slavery, and any lands south of the line could be open to slavery. And so, as you can see, that is really the situation in the nation at the time of the Mexican-American War. So when the Mexican War concludes, Texas will now be annexed, will be part of the United States, and Texas will be a slave state. And then this Mexican Cession, this area in the West, the land given to the United States as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that will be the question mark. What will happen in these new lands? So the institution of slavery in the early 1800s is significantly different than at the outset of the American colonies. After the War of 1812, there were significant increases. So there was a boom in the cotton industry for a few reasons. The cotton gin, the market revolution, the industrialization of the North, all of this demanded there was a higher demand for cotton, which then fueled the plantation systems in the South. And so we see slavery begin to shift away from the coast and begin moving more west. So from 1820 to 1860, you can see that the enslaved population goes from 1.6 million to 4 million. So in a period of 40 years, there is a massive increase in the enslaved population. And also note that the importation of new enslaved persons was banned after 1808. So this is all, most of it is coming from really the forced breeding that took place on plantations. So what began to happen in the United States were growing debates over the morality of slavery and also the expansion of slavery. So these debates became so heated that there was actually a gag rule that was passed in Congress. So from 1836 to 1844, any proposals dealing with ending slavery were not allowed to come before Congress. And so it's really not until 1844 that this begins to change, where Congress will begin to determine what to do with new territories that want to become states. So the problem is, like we talked about, slavery had been traditionally kept out of politics, especially with the gag rule. Congress had the power to set conditions to make territory states, and they had the power to forbid slavery in new states. And so the Mexican Cession is going to bring this back into the forefront of political debate. So one of the first proposals is going to be called the Wilmot Proviso. This was proposed in 1846, and the proposal was to outlaw slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. So this was kind of preemptive because the Mexican Cession doesn't happen until 1848. So this proposal is trying to get ahead of the issue and have a solution before the land even becomes part of the United States. But Southern senators will prevent it from passing. But what this does is it brings it to congressional debate. Kind of for the first time since that gag rule, it is brought back into Congress. A Boston newspaper said, "As if by magic, it brought to a head the great question that is about to divide the American people." So next up in the conflict is going to be with California. And this is really the catalyst for the Compromise of 1850. So California applied to be a free state in 1849. And at this point, there was a very fragile balance in Congress with 15 free states and 15 slave states. And many Southerners feared that if California came in as a free state, the next obvious states to come in, Oregon and New Mexico, would also be free. And so that would tip the balance in favor of the free states. Senator Jefferson Davis, who eventually becomes president of the Confederate States of America, says, "We are about to permanently destroy the balance of power between the sections." And famous Senator John C. Calhoun says, "As things now stand, the South cannot with safety remain in the Union." So really in 1849, talks of secession are absolutely beginning to happen. So Henry Clay, who's known as the Great Compromiser, he came up with he was kind of the guy behind the Missouri Compromise in 1820. He drafted a series of proposals to avert sectional crisis and try to prevent this potential secession. So the main aspects of his compromise, the Compromise of 1850, are to admit California as a free state, and then allow the territories of New Mexico and Utah to determine for themselves whether slavery will be allowed in their state. So kind of push the issue out of Congress and instead allow the people of the territories to determine. It resolved a border dispute between Texas and New Mexico and issues of a debt that Texas had. It abolished the slave trade in the District of Columbia. So allowed slavery to exist, but abolished the slave trade. And then it also enhanced the fugitive slave law. We're going to talk about that fugitive slave law more closely because that's the incredibly controversial aspect of this whole compromise. So debates. Most members of Congress just disliked it. Both sides just felt like it didn't go far enough for their side. John C. Calhoun again forecast secession. Senator Daniel Webster has one of his most famous speeches where he promotes unity. He promotes the compromise. He says, "I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union." Henry Clay and President Taylor are going to die before the compromise is approved, and President Fillmore is going to be responsible for actually enacting the compromise. So here you can see is the difference that happens from the Missouri Compromise to the Compromise of 1850. So you can still see that most northern areas are going to prohibit slavery and most southern areas are going to permit slavery. However, there's this new area where popular sovereignty in the yellow will be used to determine the status in those areas. The term popular sovereignty is going to come up in future lessons as well. So let's go back to this Fugitive Slave Act. Just a little context here, just a reminder that the core of this law is not new. There was a Fugitive Slave Act in the Constitution when it was written, but it was expanded, and these expansions are what really fueled like a crisis in the North. So included in this expansion is a new corps of federal agents to capture runaway enslaved persons. It wasn't just private slave catchers paid by the slave owners. It was now a federal agency that was involved as well. There was also court-appointed federal commissioners. So when a person was captured, they'd be brought before a commissioner, where the commissioner would determine if that person was actually free, as they stated, or if they were actually a fugitive. Now, the interesting thing is that these commissioners were paid double if they determined that the person was a fugitive, and the person had no appeal and no jury. Additionally, in the expansion was that people who aided fugitives, like for example on the Underground Railroad, they could be fined up to $1,000 for that. And so this just act was incredibly divisive in the North. And here are two examples of where the enforcement of the act really fueled the abolitionist movement. So Anthony Burns was someone who escaped from slavery, worked in a clothing store, and under the act, a federal marshal arrested him. And when he was at his trial, the courthouse was attacked. One of the marshals was killed, I believed. It was very violent. And so President Pierce is actually going to order the military to uphold the law. And so Anthony Burns is going to be taken in cuffs, marched through the city in handcuffs with the military there to enforce this act. An additional horrific story is the story of Margaret Garner. And when she was on the Underground Railroad with her children when slave catchers arrived, and instead of sending her children back into slavery, she attempted to kill them and was successful in killing, I believe, her 2-year-old daughter. And this was it led to one of the longest fugitive slave trials in history, and really shocked the nation to think that how a mother could determine that death was a better alternative than slavery was it really it brought passion to the issue for many Northerners that they hadn't been aware of before. So the thing that really fueled the outrage over the act, probably the biggest catalyst, is going to be the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. So in this book, it presents the cruelty and immorality of slavery. It's important to note that there was censorship happening in the South. So it was difficult to get the real image of slavery into the North because of things that were, the control over the media. Uncle Tom was portrayed as the ever patient and kind enslaved man with his evil owner, Simon Legree. They are a huge part of the story. And additionally, an enslaved woman, Eliza Harris, makes a heroic escape with her baby. So this book became incredibly popular in the North. It was the best-selling book of the century, besides the Bible. But Southerners argued that it was a false picture of the South and slavery. So I'm going to read you just a very short excerpt from chapter 30 here to kind of get an image in your mind of how Beecher Stowe wrote. Tom hardly realized anything, but still the bidding went on, rattling, clattering, now French, now English. Down goes the hammer again. Susan is sold. She goes down from the block, stops, looks wistfully back. Her daughter stretches her hands toward her. She looks with agony in the face of the man who has bought her, a respectable, middle-aged man of benevolent countenance. "Oh, master, please do buy my daughter." "I'd like to, but I'm afraid I can't afford it," said the gentleman, looking with painful interest as the young girl mounted the block, and looking around her with a frightened and timid glance. The blood flushes painfully in her otherwise colorless cheek, her eye has a feverish fire, and her mother groans to see that she looks more beautiful than she ever saw her before. "I'll do anything in reason," said the benevolent-looking gentleman, pressing in and joining with the bids. In a few moments they have run beyond his purse. Her master is Mr. Legree, who owns a cotton plantation on the Red River. She is pushed along into the same lot with Tom and 2 other men, and goes off weeping as she goes. The benevolent gentleman is sorry, but then the thing happens every day. One sees girls and mothers crying at these sales always. It can't be helped, and he walks off with his acquisition in another direction. So you can see how the details provided here of the slave auction, which Northerners would maybe have never heard about or seen before, really was an emotional thing to read. So I actually have the book here. It is quite long, but I highly encourage you to check it out. It's a great listen to on Audible as well, but I do definitely want to recommend this as really important read for understanding an aspect of American history. So that concludes our lesson today on the Compromise of 1850. And you want to make sure that, again, you're really understanding kind of the similarities and differences in how those regional attitudes affected federal policy after the Mexican-American War. I hope this video was helpful for you. And if so, please like and subscribe.